first off, Lisa,
Yes.
there were a lot of women apparently poisoning their husbands in the 1800s in America.
Yes.
Like, were there? I mean, I had never heard of this.
This is such a fabulous question from your listener. And it's actually the exact question I wanted to answer. And one of the impetuses for me writing this book, I had heard the expression, perhaps you've heard it too, Bob, that poison is a woman's weapon. And I was very curious to know, is that true? And then if it's true, how did that become so? And then if it isn't true, why has that sort of persisted? And one of the early articles I encountered when I was researching for this book, which is The League of Lady Poisoners, Illustrated True Stories of Dangerous Women, was this amazing article by brilliant writer and authority on all things poison-related, Deborah Blum. It's an article that she wrote for Wired in 2013 called The Imperfect Myth of the Female Poisoner. And she actually clarifies in it that this is actually a cultural stereotype. It's actually a misconception. The poison is much more likely to be a gender neutral weapon. And if you actually look at the statistics, a greater proportion of poisoners are men. And that is because most murderers are men. Like 90% of all murders are committed by men, and therefore they use every tool, including poison, more than women. However, women are more likely to be serial poisoners, and that has to do with stereotypes about who commits murder and who gets investigated for murder, and that allows them to go on committing their crimes a lot longer. So there's a lot of interesting misconceptions at play here that kind of led to us believing that this is true. However, in the cases where it does happen, they got so sensationalized in the media and in the press, and people got obsessed with this idea of the specter of the poisoning wife, sort of undermining society, every element of society, and just taking an incredible amount of power and danger in this singular act. So, okay, that's some context before we get to the heart of the question is, why were there so many poisoning murders committed by women, specifically against men, in the 19th century, in the 1800s, what we consider to be the Victorian era? And there's a number of reasons for that. And I know this is specifically American history, so I'll definitely try to focus there, but it was true in the UK as well. In the Victorian era, poison, specifically arsenic, what we call the king of poisons, sometimes cheekily called inheritance powder, was so ubiquitous, was so prevalent that the joke was you could buy arsenic as easily as a loaf of bread. It was available in every grocery store, every druggist shop for pennies. It was the cheapest poison. It almost made it democratic. And the reason it was so available was it was used as a rat poison. So in all the kitchens, in all of the homes and the restaurants and the businesses, everyone's going to have a healthy supply of arsenic on hand. And that created a really dangerous situation where arsenic was available. And then you had a time period where women did not have a lot of agency. And it's almost created this perfect storm of giving these often oppressed people access to a really dangerous material. And that is kind of the heart of how this was able to get started and keep going. And then more about arsenic just being difficult to detect and prove in terms of toxicology until science advanced much later.
Arsenic, the people's poison.
That's right.
So what is a famous serial poisoner case from that time period in America, and what happened? Take us into a deep dive into one of those instances.
Yeah, and there's definitely a lot. And I would encourage you to check out the book to look at some more of these phenomenal stories or fascinating stories. I think one that jumped into my head when I was thinking about the episode for today was a woman named Amy Archer Gilligan. And she, again, in the 1800s, she opens this retirement home in Connecticut. And she realized, and again, this is very early in the retirement home, senior living facilities are not really a thing. She's almost sort of a pioneer in this field.
I love it. A pioneer in the field of serial poisoning.
She realized that the only way to get new inmates, and that's what they called them at the time, not residents, but inmates, into her residence was when somebody died. And so she realized she had a financial sort of impetus to get rid of some people to make new rooms available, because that was the only way she could make more money. And so she essentially started poisoning her various residents at the senior living facility. And it wasn't until a writer for the local newspaper noticed that her facility even though it was much smaller than other similar facilities, was having like 4 times the amount of deaths, that they started to investigate. And she was eventually found guilty of the murders of all of a great number of folks who lived in her care, which I think is part of what's so complicated about women killers in general, is that they often will use weapons, or they'll use murder to harm those closest to them or people in their care. And sometimes you'll hear of nurses and other folks in these sort of positions as called angels of mercy, and they're saying they're doing it sort of as a merciful act for someone who to put someone out of their misery. But in her case, it was purely financial.
I think about newspapers back in this time period. I love, and there are newspaperarchive.com or .org.
Yes,
I
yes.
mean, yeah, incredible. Like when I do my research, I love going back 1840s, 1850s, reading the papers of the times, and they're gossipy by nature. They're sensationalistic by nature.
Oh, yeah.
We talk about biased media today. Each paper was biased in one way or another. Many owned by certain political parties or factions or politicians. So, with all of that in mind, were these stories of these women poisoners, were they popular in the day?
Were they popular? This was catnip. Are you kidding? The readers loved this. And so much of what I learned while researching this was that the stories really took this incredible turn when they got to the media. And it wasn't so much that the crime was on trial as the woman, her character, and her appearance. And women who were more traditionally feminine and sort of more demure were more likely to get off by the often male jurors. But women who were, you would see these really insane articles where they were just commenting on specifically Amy Archer, the woman we were just talking about, Amy Archer Gilligan, comments that even though she was in her 30s, she looked much older. She looked very matronly, and just the way they write about her is very cruel and very harsh, just based on her appearance, let alone her actions, which, for the record, were abominable. Just really judged in the court of public opinion. And I do love reading these Victorian era articles because they're so sort of snarky and sassy in a way we don't expect. I think we think of very sort of erudite and florid language being Victorian, and they will just make these cutting remarks where you're like, oh, that's a terrible burn. That was really mean.
Yeah, they had a way of slicing and dicing people. What we call that, like dissing people,
Yes.
or sick burns, we
Yes.
like to say these days.
Yeah.
No one did it better than in the 19th century. Like we could learn, like any rapper could learn a thing or two from reading newspapers in the 19th century. And same as it ever was, right? Like true crime. I mean, it is catnip today, just like it was hundreds of years ago.
Yeah, and I thought about that a lot. Like, why are so many of us so fascinated by true crime? Why is this something that I listen to, like episodes of Dateline, old episodes of Dateline all the time, and I was trying to think about why am I so drawn to this? Why are so many people so drawn to this? And I think it's because it's brilliant examples of storytelling. It's great narrative. You have all of these fascinating characters. You have this terrifying climax, and in the end, ultimately, hopefully, you get some kind of resolution and justice. And I think we're just fascinated by the darker side of things, and it's a safe way to kind of get close to and approach to the things we're most afraid of is by listening to true crime podcasts and reading true crime books and TV and movies and all kinds of media.
So it's funny you brought up Dateline, and when I saw your book and began to research your work, I thought immediately of Dateline, 2020, and 48 Hours.
Thank you. I'm honored.
And yes, well, there was one I saw last. Well, there's a famous one. My wife and I joke about the Black Widow. They're like that's a famous 20th, like late 20th century situation like this, where the woman I think poisoned multiple husbands.
Yes.
And then there's one from, I believe I saw it yet last year. It could have been a repeat. And I don't remember which brand it was, 48 Hours, 2020, or Dateline. But the woman poisons her children with antifreeze.
Antifreeze. Yeah, I know which one you're talking about. That one was heartbreaking.
And they're heartbreaking. They're chilling. You don't understand how someone could do this. but from your book, it's not uncommon. So let me ask you this: you talked about arsenic being like the go-to poison of people. Were there any other like plants, animals, chemicals that were used back in the 19th century to get the job done?
Yes, absolutely. And it is so fascinating, specifically the antifreeze example, because it has some of the qualities that arsenic has. So it's almost so interesting to see that parallel. So just to go back to arsenic, at the time, it's colorless, it's odorless, it's tasteless. If anything, it tastes a little bit sweet. And antifreeze, unfortunately, also tastes a little bit sweet. So it's very easy. And again, for the record, none of this is a how-to. Please do,
Right. We're
please do
disclaimer.
not get
Yes.
any ideas from this. These are cautionary tales. I'm not giving advice or instructions.
It's terrible we have to say this, but please do not murder
No,
anyone with any kind of a chemical or a
no.
poison.
And again, the toxicology today, it's not like in the Victorian era. They can prove these poisoning cases and people will get caught. But again, we have the prevalence of arsenic for sure in the Victorian era. There are poisonous plants. You don't see them as much in the Victorian era. You'll see them in a lot of the earlier crimes. But some of my favorites are deadly nightshade, or what we call belladonna, poison hemlock, foxglove. And I love some of the alternate names for these. Like foxglove is also called witch's gloves or dead man's bells. As we know, opium poppies can be very dangerous as well. Wolfsbane, also called monk's hood, devil's helmet, women's bane, or the queen of poisons. And strychnine, of course, is a terrible poison as well, it comes from the gray disc-shaped seeds of a tree native to India and southern Asia, and it is one of the most violent poisons on record. In terms of other sort of poisonous elements and chemicals you might come across, which will relate more to crimes that you'll see in the 19th century, I would say mercury, lead. Occasionally, you'll see thallium and cyanide.
Talk about mercury. That came up in a recent episode we did about uh, Civil War soldiers.
Oh my goodness, yes.
And yeah. So talk about being poisoned by mercury. What is that like? What does that do to a person?
Oh goodness, it's a terrible question. So mercury is a naturally occurring metallic element found in the Earth's crust. It can take a few different kinds of forms, including metallic mercury, which you might still find in glass thermometers and old dental fillings. Symptoms of mercury poisoning can include they're specifically very nasty mouth-centric symptoms, such as excessive salivation, inflamed lips and gums, tooth loss, foul breath, damage to the kidneys, and excessive exposure can lead to things like mood swings, paranoia, and mental instability. And you might have heard the expression mad as a hatter, or be thinking of the famous character from Alice in
Absolutely.
Wonderland.
Yes.
And that is because many hatters were exposed to mercury in the hat making process. And so they experienced mercury poisoning at alarming rates. And that's where that expression, unfortunately, comes from.
This is American History Hotline. I'm your host, Bob Crawford. Today, my guest is Lisa Perrin, author and illustrator of the book, The League of Lady Poisoners. It's such a cool book. We'll put a link in the show notes. We're talking about women poisoners of Victorian era America. Remember, send us your burning questions, burning, not poisonous questions, your burning questions about American history. Record yourself using the voice memo app on your phone and email it to americanhistoryhotline@gmail.com. That's americanhistoryhotline@gmail.com. Now back to the show. All right. One thing I really want to ask you about is your artwork.
Oh,
Is the illustrations. Talk about your life as an artist and how you married these two interests of history and art.
thank you. That's such a thoughtful question. So I am personally a professional illustrator. I'm just a humble picture maker by trade, but I've always had this deep personal interest in history. I love history, specifically women's history, and true crime. And I'm also a full-time professor of illustration at the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore. I primarily illustrate book covers. That's been my sort of bread and butter of my freelance work. But a long time ago, many moons ago, I was also an English major in college, and it's always been my secret dream to write and illustrate a book. But it was something I wanted so much that it was hard to start. And I didn't know what was the right topic. And I think I realized that no one was going to just write my dream book for me, that I wanted to create a vehicle to draw what I wanted to draw. And I was like, oh, I need to make it. It has to be me. And it led to this really incredible situation where I started researching women poisoners, which I know sounds like a random place to start. A friend sent me an article about a famous woman poisoner named Giulia Tofana from the Renaissance era in Italy. And that just was so fascinating to me that I asked, are there more stories like this? Why aren't we all talking about this? This is insane. And I did a series of illustrations based on 2 or 3 women poisoners that I found and wrote small blurbs or biographies about them. And then I pitched it to a publisher who went like, yeah, let's do it. And that was an amazing journey. I loved drawing this. So for me, I get to do the research of both for the writing, but also visual research. Like, okay, what would this person have worn in this time? What would their hairstyle have been like? And I get to do a lot of really fun visual referencing and research, and then I get to cobble them together into my own versions. Because sometimes, especially for Victorian era, there are photographs of these women, but I also included women from earlier throughout history where there aren't, and I have this sort of incredible opportunity to create the first like a visual portrait of them, just based on the reference material and what I can find. So I really wanted to create something that was visually lavish, visually stunning. I wanted to create like a Victorian type of book with like rich illustrations, something that was almost just as much an art object as it was a book, something ideally that people would want to leave out and display in their homes. You'll notice if you pick up the book that all of the details are the accents are this bright, vivid, arsenical green, which was definitely on purpose. And I just really wanted to create both a meaningful literary journey and visual experience for the reader too. And I think it really helps because you always want to see them, like this poisoner we're talking about. Who were they? What did they look like? And I think it really helps to kind of have those 2 elements in juxtaposition.
So what was more challenging, the illustrating or the authoring?
Oh, they're both so challenging in their different ways. I loved working on this, but it was definitely very hard too. I think for me, because I'm a professional illustrator, the illustrations came to me more easily. I had to learn how to do research, and in a lot of ways by doing it wrong the first time and having to go back and do it again. And I'm very lucky that I was working with a really helpful editor at the publishing company who gave me really good feedback. But it's a process. It's a journey. I think it took 3 years from start to finish. And it's my little poisonous baby that's out there in the world right now. And the most thrilling thing, I think I often say the artist equivalent, I think, of like hearing, if you're in a band and hearing your song on the radio, like my equivalent is like seeing my book in a bookstore. And it never gets old. Like it's just the coolest thing in the world to see it get out there. And then to have these conversations with folks like you, and get to learn more about it together and just see people reacting to these stories. It's just been a wild and incredible ride.
So we talked a little bit about mercury and what that's like to be poisoned by mercury. Talk about like, because when you think about poisoning, right, you talk about how it can taste like arsenic and antifreeze have a sweet taste to it. What is like the process? How long does it take for someone to succumb to being poisoned? What does it actually look like?
Yeah, another really good question. I think we all have this misconception from like the movies or like films based on Agatha Christie's books where like someone takes a swig out of a golden goblet and they suddenly grab their stomach or their throat and
Yeah.
they fall to the floor convulsing. And it's a really powerful image, but it's not totally accurate. I think what I've learned is that most poisons can actually take a very long time to work or go into an effect. And it depends on the the way the poison was distributed to the individual. So there are two main kinds of poisoning, one being acute and the other being chronic. And acute is what it sounds like: you're given a mega dose of poison all at once, like something outrageous that could, take out like 100 men they give to like one person. And that's when you have that grabbing the throat, grabbing the stomach, falling to the ground. Most poisoners that I researched, specifically women poisoners, did not do that because that attracts a lot of attention and people are much more likely to investigate that. They were much more likely to participate in a sort of chronic approach to their poisoning, by which they're giving small amounts of the poison, in doses over time, which is much more likely to mimic a lot of common diseases of the era, like cholera or tuberculosis. The person might actually get a little better and then get a little bit sicker, and it looks much more natural. And that's one of the reasons that the chronic poisoners were much more likely to get away with their crimes, especially in times before there were great advances in toxicology to determine what was the means of death, if it was indeed chemical.
Well, let me ask you this, if I can, and I'm going to break my own rule, because
Okay.
we're going to leave America for just a moment.
Where are we going?
Ancient Egypt,
Oh my.
aren't there like occurrences in the ancient world where people were poisoned by animals like spiders and things like that? Talk about that for a second.
Oh, for sure. And I appreciate the little diversion from the regular route. Yes, I mean, the most famous story I can think of is Cleopatra, who was famously the stories that she committed suicide by taking a poisonous asp snake and bringing the snake to her chest and letting it strike her and bite her. And then she dies from the venom. There's now a lot of scholarship that says that that is likely not true. If she did die by poison, it was likely that she would have drank it. There's no way to know that the venomous asp would kill her in a single bite. It was too much to leave up to chance. But yeah, there's actually a number of venomous or toxic animals that you might come across in some of these stories. The black widow spider being one, the cobras being another.
How would someone use a cobra to poison?
So this is one of the reasons why I think that it's not terribly likely. It's very hard to get like toads to do your bidding or like send out your spiders and get them to do what you want. I think it's much more likely to be an accident. I think if you're going to get experience poisoning by this method, but you will read some of these sort of stories from the ancient world where they claim that they used a poisonous snake or a poisonous spider that they sent them to sort of bite or infect this person with the poison to sort of. And again, a lot of these stories have to do with figures who were in power. You'll often have especially you mentioned Caesar salads and ancient Rome, but there's a long litany of stories of deposing emperors and a lot of scheming behind the scenes to get the heir they want in line for power and using poison or different methods of doing that.
I saw this quote that called poison, quote, the great equalizer for women in the 19th century. I see a time period when women, they're powerless. There's no mental health care. Poison is everywhere, as you already explained. And there aren't really any tests to detect it. Mm-hmm. So was this like a perfect storm moment for poisoning? Like, did poisoning have its moment?
It totally did. And that's actually, I think, the exact same phrase that I use. It's a perfect storm. You have a lot of individuals, women who do not have the same kind of rights as men. When they marry, they lose inheritance rights. They lose autonomy. There are not a lot of rules to protect women from domestic abuse at the hands of their husbands. Essentially, he has the right to do that to her, and there's very little protection. There's also very little mechanisms to leave an abusive relationship. Divorce is very rare. It is socially frowned upon. It is often very expensive and difficult to procure. So you end up with people trapped potentially in dangerous and abusive situations, and they have access to poison. And it creates, like you said, this sort of perfect storm where if they are able to, there's this chance that they could get away with it, right? If they pass it off to look natural. And again, during the Victorian era, you have such a high mortality rate from diseases. Unfortunately, it's not unusual for a relatively healthy adult to get sick and pass away suddenly. And as long as they do it subtly and they don't draw too much attention to themselves, and some of them can't help it and they do, you have these situations sometimes where you get serial poisonings. And again, and this is what is so complicated about it. There is this nuance of women who are doing this to avoid or escape abuse, and then the ones who are doing it purely for evil machinations, who just want to get more life insurance policies or just pure evilness, want to get rid of a person. And there's some nuance in there because they're not the same, but then do we treat them the same? And I that's one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, was because I think so many of these women in the League of Lady Poisoners get put into one camp. And I think that knowing the context gives you so much more nuance to think about the stories in a different way. Again, not condoning the actions ever, but I can think about it with a little bit more compassion if I understand that there was an abusive situation and this was perceived as the only way out.
Give us an example about getting caught. Like how did they get caught? Like when they did get caught, I mean, because we only know about it because they got caught or they confessed in some way, right? Historically speaking. So when a woman did get caught poisoning her husband or her children, how did that happen?
Yes. And usually what happens is you finally get an astute neighbor or someone who notices there's been too much going on here and they go to the police. A lot of this will depend on the timing. In the 1830s, they developed James Marsh, a British or Scottish chemist, developed a new test for arsenic to detect arsenic in the tissues of a corpse called the Marsh test. And prior to that, there was really no generally effective test to prove the presence of arsenic. You also have to remember the Victorian era, arsenic's in everything. They used it in cosmetics, they used it in dyes and fabrics, in garments that they wore, and the wallpapers in their homes. Arsenic was just such a ubiquitous part of the culture that everybody was going to have arsenic in them if you tested them. It was even part of the embalming process. So how do we prove that someone was killed deliberately in a homicidal way via arsenic? And the Marsh test was really revolutionary because it was able to detect very minute amounts of arsenic in the tissues. And again, this is after 1836. So again, prior to that, there almost is a little bit of a blank check. And you'll hear these sort of anecdotes of, well, in like the medieval times, they would throw what the person ate in the fire. And if it smelled like garlic, it was arsenic or poison, or they might, and this one's very sad because I'm an animal lover, they might give that meal to a dog or an animal to eat, and if the animal passed away, then that was arsenic. But with that would not hold up in court, So having a real test like the Marsh test that could hold up in court was really a game changer. And it became the chief terror of poisoners now that they could be detected. But again, it was up to someone to report it, for a coroner's investigation, for someone to investigate and find out if there were arsenic present in the body. And then, are there witnesses? Does someone find, the other thing was eventually in the 19th century, they created poison registers at the druggist shops. So they passed laws that said, if you sell poison, you have to write down to whom you sold it and when. And again, prior to this, it was very difficult to prove. But once they had this also helped aid in proving some of these crimes and putting some of these individuals away.
So we talked about the registry for purchasing poison. We talked about the Marsh test, some of these ways of detecting poisoning. How and when did the heyday of the women poisoners finally come to an end? If it has.
So that's a really good question. I will say the Victorian era is called the golden age of poisoning. And I do want to say, yes, for women, but also men too. Men were doing just as many, if not more, poisonings for the same reasons women were able to do it, because poison was so accessible and difficult to detect. I do think that you see a big drop off of these cases as we enter the 20th century and later. But that being said, they do still happen. And I'm always, I now, because I'm the poison lady, I get emails every time someone sees an article about a woman poisoner in the modern context. And one of the things, I know that, again, we're focusing on American history here, but this is global. This is not a unique phenomena to any particular country or any particular gender. It's definitely something that is that has spread. And it does still happen. And it's very sobering to see that it's a lot of the same themes and reasons. And it has to do with often abuse and lack of agency. And money. Money's the other big one, which I think can also be tied to sort of societal confinements of women not always being able to earn for themselves and have sort of financial power or autonomy either. But yeah, I think once we get these big advancements in toxicology that start to occur in the Victorian era and then into the early 20th century, and it could be proved much more easily and successfully in a court of law, you do see a drop off in poisoning cases. Also, frankly, guns are just so much more popular and I imagine easier in some ways. So you definitely see poison is no longer a popular weapon. I think the guns are by far, of all of the different means to commit homicide, guns are the winner.
Guns win.
Yeah.
Why bring arsenic to a gunfight?
It's true.
As they say.
What are you going to do? Blow the powder in their faces? Like, whoosh.
Hey, Lisa, can you real quick hold up the book?
Oh, my goodness.
Just for the heck of it.
Oh, this old thing?
Yeah. Beautiful, beautiful book, beautiful presentation. The League of Lady Poisoners. I've been talking with Lisa Perrin, author and illustrator of the book, The League of Lady Poisoners. It's such a cool book. We'll put a link in the show notes. Lisa, thanks for joining us on the American History Hotline today.
Thank you so much. This was so much fun.